Let's take you to the US. We are in the 11th hour of campaigning ahead of elections on Tuesday. Both candidates are once again rallying the key swing states in the next few hours, both heading for the same city, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, staging the last-minute pitches to undecided voters. They are just 8 kilometres away from one another. Much of the press focus in the past few hours has centres around the comments from Donald Trump in an interview to Fox News, insulting the former Republican Liz Cheney, who's now a staunch supporter of Kamala Harris, saying she always wants to go to war and wouldn't be such a war hawk, he said, if, quote, the guns were pointed at her. Let's take a listen.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
Well, the Democrats say the violent rhetoric shows why Donald Trump is such a danger to society and, quote, is not fit from office. Timely, then, to bring in my next guest this evening. In the midst of political slings and arrows thrown constantly in the past few weeks, the bitterness between camps, supporters, my next guest makes the case that the biggest enemy of democracy is polarisation, the evident lack in one side to be able to listen to the other. Keith Magee is a theologian, Protestant preacher, a Democrat who served on 2 Obama administrations for both of his campaigns, and interestingly, which we'll get into in a moment, has also publicly spoken about he doesn't necessarily think President Obama was the best thing ever to happen to America. Before we talk to Keith on that, let's take a listen to his pitch. This was his TED Talk on finding common ground to save democracy more than a year ago.
There used to be a time where we were able and had the ability to agree to disagree. That no longer exists now. We used to be able to really disagree on some major stuff, but we had a sense of finding a way to come up with some shared purposes and then working through the complicated stuff. But today, we are increasingly going into our bubbles.
Keith is with me. Great to have you on the programme this evening. Great to talk to you. I'm just interested, first of all, watching that back, Keith, are you more optimistic or less so on the eve of elections at the level of polarisation?
Thank you so much for having me this evening. I'm an eternal optimist. I always look to see how we can win and survive in our most challenging of moments and times. So I'm going to stick to my optimism in the midst of this very trying time that we're in, where we see, to your question and point, that polarization and tribalism is leading us in America or the American elections, I think, right now.
Give me you talk about being an optimist. Have you seen any examples of reach out in this election? We report a lot of the breakdown of communication, the insults. You know, it's a daily occurrence, it feels like, at the moment, where the rhetoric is pretty vicious and violent, particularly coming from the Republican contender. I just wonder, are you seeing moments where you think, there's reason to be optimistic here?
Well, I certainly have not seen Mr. Trump provide any direct reasons that we should believe that he has the tools necessary for empathy to bring us forward as a nation. So I'm quite appalled by his behavior. As you introduced me early on, you did highlight the fact that I am a Protestant minister. So within that context, I believe in reconciliation and forgiveness. The things that we are hearing come out of his mouth and those who are allowing such rhetoric to stand and not coming against it is quite disappointing. You know, one of the things that holds true about America and our Constitution in America, though it is a secular document, it repeatedly reminds us of this idea from the Constitution to the national anthem to the currency, that it's supposed to rest in this idea of in God we trust. So that's where my sense of optimism comes from.
Let me ask you about something. You talked about working for former President Barack Obama. There's a very interesting campaign moment where we're looking at the figures of black men voting for Kamala Harris, and it appears that it's slightly down on those who are voting for President Biden last time around. Let's have a listen to what former President Obama had to say about that.
I'm speaking to men directly now. Part of it makes me think that, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president. And you're coming up with other alternatives and other reasons for that.
What strikes me about that, Keith, and you talk about the importance of listening to the other side, and I'm minded as well, within that TED talk we played earlier, you talked about going in a cab ride with an African-American driver who was voting for Donald Trump. I just wonder, listening to that way of trying to convince people to vote for Kamala Harris, do you think that's a potentially successful strategy?
I was 100% disappointed in the approach that former President Barack Obama took with speaking to Black men on that particular day. It is not the approach. It is not the idea of the lack of interest, I believe, in a Black woman. I think it is the idea of being left behind and being marginalized and feeling as though Black men were not and are not being included. And the ideal of talking down to Black men at any point is just not something that I think is acceptable. And also, there's a need to reflect on the fact that the framers of the American civil rights movement that has moved us to this place to have voting rights, equal rights, all of the senses of equality, was led by Black men. It was Black men who set the pace, that was on the front lines, causing this kind of movement to happen even for Barack to find his way to the presidency. So I think a better way forward is to talk about what mobilizes all people who are interested in democracy and ensuring that everyone has a fair chance at the, quote, American dream. You know, this election does not rest on Black men and their turnout. It actually rests on how white women will show up and vote in the next 78 hours.
Can you expand for me something that you touched upon within your TED Talk, which is this idea that you actually paid quite a lot of money to sit in the back of a taxi to talk to an African-American voter on why they're voting for Donald Trump?
So yes, I was in Cleveland, Ohio for the funeral services for former Congressman Louis Stokes, and literally missed the repast as a result of sitting there because the gentleman thought that Donald Trump at that time in 2016 represented a way forward. He thought that he could bring jobs, that he would be ideal for the working class because of this idea of having built hotels. And this gentleman had been a former construction worker who had lost his job and had resulted to driving an Uber. So there was a sense of hope that Donald Trump would have because he would care about the working class. Juxtaposed to that is that's the same conversation that I heard in 2008 when I was in Ohio, in the southern part of Ohio, in Lancaster and Chillicothe, Ohio, from white working class men who said that they thought that Barack Obama would actually understand the plight of the poor as a Black man. So you have this Black man in Cleveland in 2016 believing that Donald Trump would provide hope. You had white men in 2008 thinking that Barack would provide hope. What's the common theme? A hopeless people who are in need of hope, who are in need of opportunity, sustainability, economic system that will speak to them, housing, jobs. So, yeah.
It's very interesting. One thing that I'm also minded of as you're explaining that is, I just wonder your take on this. For me, one of the most interesting moments in the campaign was where there was a lesser known, actually. It was where Donald Trump was speaking to Latino voters. He went on a Spanish network, Univision, and he was asked by a voter, tell me 3 things that you like about Kamala Harris. And he scratched his head. He said, this is the most difficult question that I have been asked all night. He said, people are loyal to her. She's in it for the long run. She's a fighter and she seems likable, but I think she's a very bad person. She's bad for the country, etc. Back to his rhetoric. But I think it might speak to where you're looking here, the kind of moments where you go, there's 2 human beings meeting in the middle somewhere.
Yes, and that's what we really need. I think the American public, the American voter, are all of us are a bit frightened in this moment about what this looks like going forward. And we need to see the sense of humanity, of understanding that we all have a soul, we all have a sense of core values, though those values may differ. But how do we get to that place of understanding what is best for America through our collective humanity? How do we get there? Certainly, that was a defining moment for Mr. Trump, and I welcomed it. And so, if we could get more of that, not only from him, but from his supporters, to understand that there's a very human element here, and not to set the country back, and perhaps not to even air the lack of progress that we've made. And I think that this moment speaks to this. We thought with the election of Barack Obama that we had reached the point that America was a post-racial society. Well, now we know that wasn't true then. It certainly isn't true now. How do we get there is the question. We get there by representing who we are as human beings and what are our core values towards, again, having sustainability and economically and jobs and housing and those sorts of things. And that's what we really need at this moment.
Very briefly and finally, this interests me as well, Keith, that you've recently been appointed by the Biden-Harris administration, the US ambassador to the UK, to the US-UK Fulbright Commission, so the cultural connection between the two. And I think you've previously raised a point that there are lessons, perhaps, from the UK in the queuing system, how we can talk to those around us. Tell us about that.
Well, listen, I think that, again, the elements here of a shared and collective humanity in the midst of the polarization around politics and what we differ with and what we think matters most to us as individuals. And I think we often have a tendency to try to focus on the very large issues around, tax cuts, right? Around understanding policies. But the brilliance of what I've learned in my last 13 years of living in the UK is this ideal of queuing, the ideal of where you stand together and you learn together and you wait together. And I believe that in these moments, if we could stop talking about and approaching the hard issues and maybe ask the person that's in the queue with you, why did you come to the cinema today? Or what's your favorite ice cream? Or something very simple. Where's your nan from?
Yeah.
If we can maybe approach some of the simple questions, then maybe we could find our sense of humanity and find a way forward without the toxic issues that are leading us.
Keith, a real pleasure to talk to you. Keith Magee, Professor and Senior Fellow in Culture and Justice at UCL. Hope to speak to you soon when we know what's happening on the other side of the election. Until then, we will be live Tuesday night as the results start to come in for a special programme here on France 24 into the early hours, into the witching hour, into the Wednesday as well. We'll have correspondents all over the US and all the key swing states too. Stay with us. We'll be back here on France 24 in just a moment.